So I'd like to welcome you to Nick Courtney.
Well, thank you. I will hopefully not go too much into the theological and esoteric, although given that my background is philosophy and medieval studies, I think we're probably going to visit that a little bit. But it's a real grace to be standing in this chapel speaking to you tonight about Ignatian spirituality. And it's a grace for which I'm very grateful. 10 years ago, I was a regular in this chapel, halfway through my undergraduate education here. And it was about that time that I began to be impressed by the distinctive approach of the Jesuits that I was getting to know. Though I was not yet ready to entertain the thought of becoming one, I can look back and see the seeds planted, many of them in this very chapel. And for me, it's especially fitting to be part of this particular series of speakers, as it was Father Ted Dziak who first encouraged me to consider a Jesuit vocation. And it was in his class that I first took a long look at Ignatius. It was Sean Salai, who will speak here in a few weeks, who was then a novice and first got me into a Christian life community where I began to experience Ignatian spirituality myself. It was Father Sylvester Tan, who will speak next week, who was here years later when I came back to work here and who walked with me and challenged me in my discernment as I asked myself whether I was being called to follow Jesus in this order founded by Ignatius. So hopefully there will be some connection between my talk tonight and those in the weeks to come, since those two speakers have been teachers and mentors to me. I thought today it occurred to me that I should probably start actually by giving a bit of an overview of Saint Ignatius's life, just to not make the mistake of assuming that everybody is familiar with it, because I'm going to refer to key events in Ignatius's life that I think help us to understand who he was and why he's especially important today. And I think having the bigger picture will help. So he was born at the very tail end of the medieval period, at the end of the 15th century, to a noble family in northern Spain. And as the son of a nobleman, he sought to make a fortune for himself, sought to win honor and glory as a soldier. And this brought him to Pamplona, where he defended a fort against a larger French force that really he shouldn't have been fighting. And he wound up suffering an injury in that battle. But the French were so impressed with his courage and valor and how seriously he took his role in defending the fort that they actually brought him back to his family home of Loyola, the family castle. And there it was during his convalescence that he began to experience a conversion, in part because of his sister-in-law, who was his caretaker and who wouldn't allow him to have the romance novels that he liked. Instead, he had the lives of the saints and the life of Christ. And it was through the imaginative daydreaming of these different paths in his future, the path of the knight of the romance or the path of St. Francis, St. Dominic, that he began to learn how to discern and to undergo his own conversion. From there, he decided to undertake a life of penance, and he went to Montserrat, a retreat, and lived in a cave at a place called Manresa, where he engaged in feats of asceticism, fasting and allowing his hair and fingernails to grow, and all of the things that medieval spirituality encouraged in ascetics. But he found that wasn't what God was calling him to either. And through mystical visions and experiences, he realized that actually he needed to move on from that. And so he went on a pilgrimage that would eventually take him to Jerusalem, where he'd hoped to basically be martyred as a preacher. But he wasn't allowed to stay there because of the fact that the relationship between the Christians and Muslims in the Middle East was so precarious. And so he was sent back to Europe, where he started to study, because he realized that if he really wanted to be a preacher, if he really wanted to minister the word of God as he felt called to do, that he had to have the credentials to do so. He had to be trained as preachers in those days were. And so he underwent studies first in Spain and then in Paris. And it was in Paris that he found himself amongst these companions, these men who would eventually become the first handful of Jesuits. They realized that they were called to something greater. And so they took vows, at that time, not the vows that Jesuits take today, but vows of poverty, chastity, and a desire to go to Jerusalem and to minister there. But they realized that they wouldn't necessarily be allowed to go, and in fact they weren't. The Pope told them no because it was still so dangerous. And so the Pope encouraged them instead to give themselves in service in the surrounding dioceses, places that were in real need of learned men, learned preachers, learned priests. And so they did. And through that, and through the fact that they continued to be denied the opportunity to go to Jerusalem, they realized that God was actually calling them to start a religious order, to start a new community. And from there, the Jesuits were born. So that is a broad strokes, a sort of summary of the Wikipedia article of Ignatius's life. I'm sure that was repetition for a lot of you, but hopefully it contextualizes what I'm about to say. Because as I've thought about what I, as a young Jesuit now, see when I look at Ignatius, I couldn't help but start with memories of my first impressions, which were very different. I remember from the images and stories I first encountered here that my sense of Ignatius was of a headstrong, determined man, a man with a look in his eyes showing willfulness and strength. But this hard-nosed image was quickly complicated by learning of his constant sense of discernment, which could look at first glance like a free-spiritedness. I remember what struck me most and captured my imagination was that this was a man willing to fail, willing to risk embarrassment, a man untroubled by the deadlines and expectations of the world around him. As an undergraduate trying constantly to figure out my own path and feeling pressure to succeed in specific ways and according to specific timelines, I was drawn to this saint who'd had the courage to really set aside worldly criteria of success and seek a vocation amidst uncertainty. The image of a 30-something Ignatius sitting with schoolboys to learn Latin still resonates with me to this day. And I like to remind myself that Ignatius was almost 50 when he did those things for which we most remember him. At that moment, though, I was still seeing Ignatius in mostly worldly terms, finding in him an exception to the general rules and expectations of adulthood that I was then facing. As my anxiety, frustration, and fear grew, he became a more impressive figure, but always a historical one, always a saint and wise man from another time. There was a part of me that found in Ignatian spirituality a means of challenging my paradigms of success. But I found I was really replacing some notions of success with others, and often still just sneaking those same deadlines and expectations back in with all their anxiety and frustration. I had not yet really understood the depth of Ignatius's radical choice, nor the source of his freedom, the freedom I was still seeking. I think that my initial impressions of Ignatius can be common ones. As I've gone deeper into Ignatian spirituality, I've come to see how easy it is to fit elements of it and elements of Ignatius into our own pre-existing categories. In this way, I think we can make of Ignatius a very American saint. He becomes the great doer, the man of action. Unlike Aquinas, the thinker, or Teresa, the contemplative, or Francis, who spoke with birds, we think of Ignatius as the man who identified problems and fixed them with people and institutions, with creativity and industriousness. We might call him a contemplative in action, but I think there's always a temptation to focus on the action and see it as justifying our own inclination to prioritize action. At least that's been my experience. Our nation is known worldwide not so much for an excess of prayer as for a widespread tendency for overwork. Likewise, we can make of Ignatius an individualist. We rightly pick up on his conviction that God can and does deal directly with us, that ultimately we are capable of a deep personal relationship with God the Father, with Christ, and with the Spirit. We see the ways early Jesuits like Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci are often depicted as lone rangers on frontiers. The recent film Silence might be seen in a similar light. This is compounded with perceptions that Jesuits have often been at the periphery of the church and even at odds with the hierarchy. What comes out is a picture of Ignatius that might seem to endorse individualist and anti-institutional tendencies in American culture, the spiritual but not religious approach that has become so common. And with this image, I think, comes another related one, that of Ignatius the psychologist or even the therapist. Here we focus on how keenly aware of human psychology he seems to have been in an age long before it was a science. We look to his rules for discernment as principles for working through our internal issues and becoming happier people. Though this image isn't quite a self-help book approach, it tends in that direction. I am a broken person, and I've found in Ignatius a guru who has keys allowing me to fix myself. I've found myself using each of these images of Ignatius at moments of my life, and probably continue to slip into them from time to time, mainly because none of them are totally off base. There's a bit of truth in each of them. Each gets at something real about Ignatius, but I think each also brings unhelpful baggage from our own culture that winds up blocking our view of the deeper Ignatius and the challenges he offers to us and to our culture. Now, 10 years later, I can look through these images and see an even deeper man and a deeper saint. In many ways, he's less mysterious, but that has only made him more impressive to me. I'm still enamored with the image of him learning Latin among the children, but now I have a better appreciation of why he did that and how it should challenge me. So tonight I would like to talk about Ignatius in three particular respects. Ignatius as a man of desire, Ignatius as a man of will, and Ignatius as a man of commitment. Whatever other perspectives can be taken on Ignatius, I think these are fundamental characteristics of who he was, and I think they are key to why he is important and captivating to us in the 21st century. And I think they're all interrelated, too. Ignatius came to make different commitments in his life by paying attention to his desires and strengthening his will. These commitments then reshaped his desires and pointed his will in a certain direction. So let's start with desire. I've often heard Ignatian spirituality described as a way of getting to your deepest desires and of discovering that your deepest desires are actually also God's desires for you. I think this is true in an important way, but it can be incomplete. I don't think we should understand Ignatius as saying that God wants us to have what we already desire. Rather, Ignatius is saying that at a fundamental level, our desires are already oriented towards God, and that there are things we can do that clear the way for those desires to be the real motivating forces in our life. In order to explain what I mean by that, I think we first need to look at Ignatius himself as a man of desire. Ignatius had great desires from a young age. If we consider his autobiography, we see that as a young man, he had great desires for fame, for honor. It seems he had the desire for the hand of a woman who was above his station, who was of even greater nobility than himself. And we can call these great desires not just because their aims were great, but because they led him to undertake noteworthy actions. His courage and inspiration at the Battle of Pamplona is one example, and another is his hard-headed demands on his convalescent bed that the surgeons actually reset his leg so that he wouldn't return to court with a limp. This was even before he had his conversion. Now, I think we can see from the young Ignatius's great desires that not all great desires are themselves good or good for us. I think that we can say that our deepest desires are great desires, but not vice versa. We cannot say that every great desire we have is one of our deepest desires, something that God planted there. I think our desires come from many different places. Some are natural, even instinctual, like the desire for warmth or for food. Some are cultural, like the desire for a job with good vacation time. Some are personal, such as the desire to see Hamilton on Broadway, which is probably a little dated now. But naturally, these categories overlap, and I think each of the ones I listed grows out of desires from the previous category. One reason we desire a good job with good vacation time is a deeper, more natural desire for relaxation and pleasure. If we think of it this way, we can see how complex our desires are. In fact, for any given desire, I think we can probably think of a number of different ways to characterize it. When I check my phone, I might have the desire to see if my friend Mia has texted me in reply to a text I just sent her. I might, at a deeper level, have the desire of feeling connected, such as when I'm riding the D train and feeling the strange loneliness of New York. I might, at an even deeper level, desire to feel love and acceptance, which is a deep desire that would point me to a close friend in the first place. And there might be other desires in play, too. More importantly, our desires aren't transparent to us. Some might be, but many are probably not. If questioned, I would probably be able to list progressively deeper desires, but I might not be able to see all of the levels, as I think many psychologists would say. And that's not how we experience these desires most of the time anyway. It's not how we live our lives. Most of the time we are acting on our desires at a surface level, in part because that's how being human works. We don't have time to stop and reflect over every desire, and we're not meant to. Still, if we never stop, and if we're not even aware that there's more to our desires than the surface, we'll miss out on the real depth of being human, and I think we'll spend most of our time in unhappiness. Ignatius knew this. He knew it from his own experiences. He faced this when he was recovering from his wounds at Loyola. With nothing but time in his own mind, he began to dig deeper into his daydreams. He asked why he daydreamed of this or that, why he liked to imagine himself as a knight winning fame, and why he liked to imagine himself following in the footsteps of St. Francis or St. Dominic. He began to wonder why focusing on some desires made him feel more alive, and others made him feel less alive. He didn't get to the bottom of it right away, But he began to sense that there was something different about his desire to be like the saints and to do great things for Christ, a Christ he was just getting to know. Maybe he also saw that both sets of desires went deeper, and maybe even there was something underlying both desires, something that rooted both of them. I think this helps us get to the idea that Ignatian spirituality is about our deepest desires. I've come to see that for Ignatius, our deepest desires are not so immediately evident to us, that they are not just those that have been with us for a long time or that have a really strong hold on us. In my experience, bad desires can do those things. But I think that Ignatius would say that if we explore those kinds of desires, then even if they aren't the best desires, we will find that they have been pulled out from a deeper desire that is good, that is from God. Ignatius's desires for honor and glory and love likely came from a deeper desire to do something great and important, to be loved and to lead a meaningful life, all potentially good desires. Yet these desires have been shaped by culture and experience, by the brokenness of human failings and sin. And so they were leading Ignatius down a path that would not fulfill those original deeper desires. And that was what he started to sense in that bed at Loyola. So when we say that Ignatian spirituality is about discovering our deepest desires and finding out that they are also God's desires for us, here is what I think is missing. What is missing is the recognition, that for Ignatius, the deepest desire is actually going to be the same for each human being. It's found right there at the beginning of the spiritual exercises in the principle and foundation. Human beings are created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by this means to save our souls. Our deepest desire, which is God's desire for us, is to live a life that leads us to God in praise and reverence and service, so that we can be with God forever. And when we tune into that desire, many of our other desires will become clearer. We will start to see which of our more immediate desires are really leading in that direction, and which ones are actually mistaken, either through bad habits or sin or just a lack of understanding. So I think that for Ignatius, the spirituality he offered was not just about our deepest desires. It was also about coming to discern which of our immediate desires are most directly rooted in that deepest desire that God gave us as part of our very nature. Once we are in touch with our deepest desires, we will be more certain of those immediate desires to teach or to work for social change or to find a career, all as ways of fulfilling that deeper one. We see this again in Ignatius' own life as a student at the University of Paris. Ignatius was not a natural student, and he seems to have struggled at times both academically and in his very desire to study. But he had identified that his deep desire was to love and serve God. Sorry, it's getting a little feedback. And to follow Christ. That was his deep desire. This led him to pursue his desire to preach and help souls through the ministry of God's word. He knew that he would always be limited in what he could do as a preacher until he got credentials, until he studied. So even though he had other good immediate desires, many of which he enjoyed pursuing much more than studies, he pursued his desire to study for the sake of the greater, deeper desires. It wasn't a painless process. As you may know, he started by studying at Alcalá in Spain, and then at Salamanca. In both places, he was trying to pursue multiple desires at once. He would try to study while also preaching, begging, having spiritual conversations with various people, doing all of these different things that he had great desires to do. And he realized twice, first at Alcalá and then at Salamanca, that this was unsustainable, that he just couldn't do that and actually study. So he moved to Paris because he knew that the language barriers and the tougher academic environment of Paris would be external constraints on those stronger immediate desires. And so I think in that story, we see a point of transition to talk about not just Ignatius as a man of desire, but Ignatius as a man of will. Ultimately, he was not ruled by his desires, great as they were. Not only did he choose the deeper desire on his sickbed in Loyola, but he kept choosing between his desires. At Montserrat, he had a desire to remain as a hermit and to do penance for the life he'd lived. He chose instead the desire that he discerned to be more directly rooted and leading towards his deepest desire to follow Christ as Christ wanted. So he went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and desired to stay there and to die as a martyr. When told to leave by the Franciscans, he chose to stay in the good graces of the church, to leave in order to stay in the good graces of the church, recognizing that he could not pursue his deeper desire to follow Christ if he was cut off from the church. And we just touched on his choice to study, even against his immediate desires to preach and help souls. So we might think about our desires as movements within us that pull us towards this or that, always seeking to fill some hole in us. Saint Augustine, thought of desires like this, as a kind of gravitational pull. Will, then, our will, is our ability to point ourselves in one of those directions and to put our own weight behind that gravitational pull. That's sort of my metaphor for it, if you will. But we can only use the will, we can only choose from the different things before us, from the different desires going on in us at any moment. So that means our will is acting on inputs from our mind and our gut, our intellect, our instincts. To get philosophical for a moment, as I said I would earlier, an ancient philosopher would say that the cognitive parts of us identify things as possible goods. They figure out the objects that might fulfill the desires in us, and then the will chooses. That's a very Cliff Notes version. But I'm glad there aren't any philosophy professors here that I know of. But as we saw in the story of Ignatius' studies, it's not so simple. There can be many goods, and there can be things that seem good but aren't. There can be decisions about balancing between goods rather than simply choosing this or that. And the strength of our desires matters. Ignatius strongly desired to be preaching and begging. And though he probably already knew at Alcalá that he couldn't do everything, he kept trying. It took time for his will to become strong enough to choose one thing and to set aside other strong desires. And from this experience and others like it, I think Ignatius' understanding of the will was shaped to take seriously the ways that it is like a muscle. Our will gets stronger with good use. If I just let myself be pulled along by whatever desire is strongest at a given moment, my will is going to be overpowered by my desires and my instincts, even when I don't want it to be. If I never build the habit of being able to choose the less appealing thing now for the sake of a deeper, long-term desire, then I'll keep being prone to short-sighted choices. Like exercise or good habits, trying to get better won't be foolproof or without failures, but the only way for Ignatius to have a strong enough will to choose Paris was to strengthen it through the failures and the negative reinforcement of Alcalá and Salamanca. And I think in Ignatius we see that using our will is about responding. For Ignatius, about responding to God, to the outstretched hand of Jesus, the one that called Peter and Andrew out of their boat, the one that called Matthew from the tax collector's table, the one that called Martha out of her daily routine. Today, I think we often talk about our will not as responsive, but as imposing. We talk about bending things or even bending people to our will, about winning contests of will. We can see our will as a way of reshaping the world around us to our liking or to the way we think it should be. I think Ignatius learned that the will is not for that, and that great change in the world doesn't come primarily from us trying to beat it into shape with our wills. Great change in ourselves doesn't happen that way either. Rather, that change comes because the Spirit is already there, ready to bring it forth, and what we ought to do is choose to cooperate. That calls for the discernment that gets to our deep desires and reorients our immediate ones, letting the Spirit draw us into God's work. Finally, I don't think our will can be bound. We can and must continue to choose. This is both a hopeful fact and a challenging one. It means that we are never so stuck in some path or behavior that God's grace and the work of others cannot help us choose a new direction. It also means that we cannot get on the right path and turn on cruise control. Trust me, that's been my experience as a Jesuit so far. I don't think any of us think that the vows that Ignatius professed just made all of his subsequent decisions for him. He continued to exercise his will in response to the work of the Spirit until his final breath. And he continues to cooperate with the Spirit as a saint of the heavenly court that he imagined so frequently in his own prayer. So just as we must continue to reflect on our desires and question how they relate to our deep desire for God, we also have to keep choosing to pursue those immediate desires that help us follow Christ. Yet Ignatius also knew the value of a commitment when it comes to orienting our desires and strengthening our will. And that is why I also have come to understand Ignatius as a man of commitment. I'll admit that the concept of commitment is broad. I made a commitment to come give this talk tonight, but that is not really in the same ballpark as my commitment to live a life as a Jesuit, as a poor, chaste man, poor, chaste, and obedient man in the society of Jesus. So not all commitments are equal, and certainly not all commitments are good. But I think Ignatius would say that commitments are very important to growing as a human being. When he professed vows at Montmartre in 1534 in France, it was because he believed that committing to something was important. I think he believed that responding to God with a will that is not tentative or temporary, but wholehearted, was the only real opportunity, the only really appropriate way to respond to God. For him, through discernment, that meant those particular vows in that particular place. The vows he made in 1534 were not ultimately his final vows, but they were a wholehearted first step towards them. And this points to how commitment can work for those of us trying to learn from Ignatius. His commitment helped him to reshape his desires and to strengthen his will. Sure, his commitment came itself from his process of digging down to his deepest desires and using that to judge his other more immediate ones. His commitment required not just one use of his will, but many leading up to the commitment itself and to those things that would come afterwards. And he couldn't make the commitment without first clarifying his desires and strengthening his will. But when he did make the commitment, he declared to himself, to God, and to those close to him that he'd made a definitive choice that he believed would help him fulfill that deepest desire in him, the desire to follow Christ and to draw close to God. He made this decision in a moment of strength after a period of training himself, and he made it precisely because he knew that he would not always be so strong, that his desires would not always be so clear, that his will would not always push him automatically towards that life with Christ. He made that commitment as a means of responding to God's grace and as a means of inviting more of God's grace in through the many dimensions of that commitment, through the psychological effect of giving his word and his heart to someone, through the visible effect of proclaiming to others what it was he valued and how he would live his life, and through the physical effect of putting himself in a setting in a community that was structured to facilitate that certain way of life. In my experience, this is something I think we risk forgetting in the church and in our culture today. It's something I've struggled with in my own life as someone who's very intellectually inclined. Since Ignatius's time, we've become more intellectualized, I think, in the sense that we can easily focus on our minds as the most important factor in who we are and what we do. We can easily act like our behaviors come out of our minds or our interior self in a one-way street. Especially in the church, we can resist or reject certain physical practices or certain less intellectual practices as unimportant or even superstitious. And sometimes that may be a good judgment about a particular practice or custom. But in studying the spiritual writings and religious culture of the medieval period, the time leading up to Ignatius's own time, I think they were really wise in their understanding of how physical habits and habits of simple memory can really shape who we are, positively or negatively. Their principle was that sometimes you have to work from the outside in, what I sometimes jokingly summarize as fake it till you make it. Sometimes you have to start by singing a song even if it doesn't resonate with your feelings or illuminate your mind. Sometimes by singing it over and over, especially in community, you find that it has started to sink in and shape who you are. Sometimes you have to choose to keep fasting or going to Mass, even if you think it's not doing anything for your spiritual life, or that you can't really sense any of its effects in your mind or your emotions. And I think that this is how a commitment works too, that it comes from inside you, but then it also works from the outside in, from structures or even constraints into an interior change in you that only comes from going for a long time in the same direction, whether you feel like it the whole time or not. And besides the change that it can work in us, or as part of that change, I think Ignatius shows also what kind of freedom commitment can give us. This sounds like one of the paradoxes of faith, but I think it's actually just practical wisdom that Ignatius shows us real freedom isn't just total open-endedness. It isn't just total autonomy. A deeper, more important, and more useful freedom is freedom from the restlessness and fear that keep us paralyzed and unable to pursue what we really desire. It is freedom from the distractedness that pulls us in 100 directions and keeps us from getting to the depths of who we are, or that keeps us from spending the time with God that draws us deeper into God's love. When you commit to something, you make some decisions ahead of time at a practical level. You rule out certain paths you might have taken and certain behaviors or pursuits that just won't be part of your life anymore. That narrowing down of your field of vision, in my experience, is a great freedom. Like it was for Ignatius, a commitment is not painless or perfect. It can be incredibly challenging, and it can be a source of struggles too. But I think they are the struggles of growth rather than the struggles of one wandering aimlessly. Commitments, too, usually involve other people. They're often relational, and good relational commitments can become a source of God's grace, as the deep desires for God and different people can help each to draw closer to God themselves. And when the commitment is directly to God, whether it be religious life or a renewed practice of prayer, I think the grace we open ourselves to is even more profound and can transform us even more. But commitments require trust, especially when they involve another person or God. If we really want to make a commitment, we don't get to set all the terms ahead of time. Part of an authentic commitment is letting that commitment make demands on us, even and maybe especially the demands we don't expect or can't foresee. When Mary said yes to God and the commitment that is a paradigm of the Christian life, she did not know everything that was going to come. She trusted and she committed herself to that relationship, whatever it would demand of her. She did that because her deepest desire was to draw close to God, and the only way she could do that in that moment was to respond to God's call, to commit to a relationship with God. And from that commitment, Christ was born, and all things were made new. God used Ignatius's commitment to inspire countless men and women to live lives of love and service over the past 500 years. That is the power of commitment. Why is this picture of Ignatius important, though? Why is it helpful to understand him as a man of desire, a man of will, a man of commitment? There are many other aspects of him that we could focus on. Ignatius, the spiritual director, who wrote something like 7,000 letters to people all across the world. Or Ignatius the pilgrim, who had a sense of always being on the journey, even when he spent 16 years based in Rome. Or Ignatius the discerner, whose rules for discernment could easily span several of these talks, and probably have in years past. I think one reason it is helpful is that I believe that many of the things I've talked about tonight, about how our desires and will and commitments work, are true generally speaking, whether we're talking about Christian spirituality or worldly ambitions or something else. These are aspects of being human, and they shape us whether we know it or not, whether we're paying attention to them or not, and whether we're trying to be better people or not. By reflecting on Ignatius, I hope we can be shaped for better and not for worse. I also think it is helpful to focus on this image of Ignatius because it has been one that has helped me to understand and reject some of the less helpful but pervasive themes of our culture today. And I hope that he helps other people to do likewise. So I'm going to talk about a few of these that I think he's especially poignant for. The first is picking up from the last aspect of Ignatius, commitment. And I think this is a problem that has been pointed to especially in my generation and the generations younger than mine. Pope Francis, in his first year as Pope, spoke strongly to young people about the fear of commitment, a fear I know well from my own 10-year journey to saying yes to my vocation. Ignatius shows us that a life without commitment is a life without a firm direction, which means that our desires will be even more likely to remain unclear and to pull us in many different directions. We also miss out on the way it helps us become stronger-willed and wiser in how we discern and choose. By making a commitment to something or someone after a good, careful discernment, we can grow in the kind of freedom that gives us purpose. The freedom we give up is usually that autonomy that I spoke of, that in my experience is more likely to bring loneliness than consolation. It just allows us to avoid the worst-case scenarios that our fear makes us imagine. And one of Ignatius's big messages is not to live a life shaped by fear. Excuse me. Another reason to come back to this image of Ignatius is that I think it helps us avoid a shallow and really tempting understanding of Ignatian spirituality, which is Ignatian spirituality as an easy justification for our desires that lets them go unchallenged. This is something I've seen especially on some of the university campuses I've worked on among people who are just learning about it, and it was one that I very easily went to myself, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. We hear that line about our deepest desires for us, our deepest desires being God's desire for us, and we skip the hard part of praying and reflecting and questioning those desires. We take Ignatian spirituality as a rationale for complacency or an excuse for sacrificing a deeper spiritual life in the service of whatever work or cause we find important. And this is one of which I've been guilty, as I said, and it's one I see not just on Jesuit campuses, but throughout our culture. I think sometimes it comes out of laziness or fear, but I also think a lot of times it comes out of an honest desire to do a bunch of good things, which eventually pushes out time for prayer, reflection, or discernment. I think Ignatius would relate to that tendency. He was much the same way as a younger man, and for all we know, even at times after his conversion. The notion of the Magus, though, was not born from Ignatius's tendencies for overwork, but from his realization that it is only through prayer and spiritual work that God can use us to achieve those great things that we actually can't even imagine yet. And that is why really knowing his story can remind us that such a superficial use of Ignatian spirituality, a use of the words without the work, is only going to keep us from the real joy and grace that God wants to give us, a fulfillment that really goes to our deepest desire. I think Ignatius also challenges our culture of valuing that freedom and autonomy for its own sake. Maybe it's less dangerous to people who've come here tonight, but I've noticed that our culture more and more has this you do you attitude. There's a new Diet Coke commercial, actually, that I saw a couple of weeks ago, and the message is literally, life is short, just do you. If you want to drink a Diet Coke, do it. That's pretty much the entirety of the commercial. Now, I don't want to make too much about a Diet Coke commercial, but I think it gets to this sort of self-involved and self-indulgent part of our culture that tells us all of our desires are equally good, and that there's no standard outside of ourselves that can tell us whether our desires are good or bad, whether pursuing them will really fulfill us or not. We're just on our own. It pretends that we don't have to answer to anyone for the choices that we make or how pursuing our desires affects other people. And it pretends, too, that we're the only ones in control of our happiness, that we can just give it to ourselves. When we grow up in that culture, or we're flooded with it all the time in songs and commercials and movies, I think we start believing it at some level. And that gets us into problems, in my experience, both personally and as a culture. Because when you get used to that way of thinking about desires, I think you become really resistant to being told that you can't just do you all the time, and that even if you try, you're just going to be unhappy from it. Ignatius is a counterexample to this idea. But usually with this, I don't think examples are enough unless we watch it happen to someone close to us or we experience it ourselves. I think usually a person who takes on the you do you mentality has to come up against their own emptiness before they can really question their desires. But in that moment, remembering or being reminded of somebody like Ignatius can be the grace that takes us from that frustration into a new life, into a new direction, just like it did for Ignatius himself when he saw the models of these other people. And for those of us who have already seen the emptiness of the you do you culture, Ignatius can be a figure of consolation for us as we think about the great legacy of a man a man who worked to figure out which desires were really from God and who kept working with God's grace to choose them, often by putting other people ahead of himself. A similar theme in our culture that can shape our imagination is what I would call the everything is already inside you principle. It comes up in movies, TV shows, and songs, usually ones aimed at a younger audience. Superhero and adventure movies tend to use it a lot, and I've seen it especially in some of the new Star Wars movies that have come out. This everything is already inside you idea usually comes through when the hero of the story or the singer of the song realizes that they never really needed the mentor or the lover or the training or the community or the process of learning or discipline. All they ever really needed was to believe in themselves and be 100% confident in what they were doing. And then they would be happy or strong or able to overcome the big obstacle. I doubt I have to explain it, but the problem here is just that I think this belief is total fantasy, which is why it's used in fantasy movies. We're sitting here at a university because we know that everything we need is not already inside us, that we have to actually engage in a learning process, a training process, a communal process. A lot of what we really need is in other people and in the disciplines and habits and traditions that we learn from those people, that we don't just know instinctively. I think a lot of what we need in order to overcome obstacles and to be happy only comes from those relationships, and especially from relationships that are hard. I imagine when Ignatius was laying on the bed in Loyola and his sister-in-law wouldn't let him have the kinds of books he wants, he probably didn't just meekly say, "Oh, okay," at first. Ignatius was many things, both before and after his conversion, but meekness does not ever seem to really be listed among his prominent character traits. I can imagine he probably got angry with her. He probably continued to have struggles with his teachers and his friends, even the other ones who would become saints, like Francis Xavier or Peter Faber. And I'm confident that those struggles and tensions and conflict and the reconciliation that followed were sources of grace and sources of growth. But even more important than recognizing this need for others and for traditions and communities that go beyond us, this everything is already inside you principle, I think, risks shaping our view of God in an unhelpful way. Like some of the other cultural tropes I've mentioned, it risks making us think that we can just find God inside of ourselves without doing the hard work of spiritual conversations with others, learning from others, engaging in the kinds of habits of faith that teach us about God, as God has been known by several thousand years worth of holy women and men. It risks, I think, tricking us into setting up some part of ourselves as a false God, probably without even realizing it. Ignatius, because he can capture the modern American imagination as what we often think of as this great American individualist saint, can actually be a way of breaking down this individualistic worldview, if we can point to how that first impression of him is actually missing the deeper, more interesting part. I think it can become an example of a favorite Ignatian saying, "We go in their door and bring them out ours." But finally, I think that one of the most important things we can gain from considering Ignatius as a man of desire, a man of will, and a man of commitment is a real belief in our ability to change and to be changed for the better. I think most of these cultural tropes I've been criticizing also feed into one that is helped by them. The idea that we don't really change and can't really change, that our flaws and failings and desires are just set. It takes many forms, but we can call it the that's just the way I am principle. I'm not a psychologist, so I can only point to the reasons I think this is so easy to fall into. I think it can come from simple laziness in the face of how hard self-discipline can be. It can come from that you do you approach to life in which I have no reason to change unless I really want to. And it can come from the disappointment of realizing that the everything inside you, everything is already inside you principle is just false. That this is something that's just the way I am can be said either in defiance or in a sense of defeatism. Ignatius's whole worldview and his spirituality are rooted in the conviction that we can change and that we should change for the better. He was not at all naive about how tough this can be. The changes he made in his own life took time and patience and work, and often they were painful. As the great Southern writer Flannery O'Connor always loved to show, grace can be violent. Grace can sometimes feel more like the desert of Lent than the sunrise of Easter. And meaningful changes to who you are rarely happen in a linear way. My own experience of trying to change for the better as I grow into my Jesuit vocation is that it happens in fits and starts, with 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. Ignatius seems to have struggled with anger as a young man. We can remember that even after his conversion, he almost attacked a Muslim man out of anger over an insult to the Virgin Mary. Even after the founding of the Society of Jesus, when Ignatius was the wise father general in Rome, he was known on occasion to lose his temper with certain Jesuits. Meaningful change doesn't mean we would never fall back to old ways, but Ignatius knew that his exercises, the spiritual exercises, and the rules for discernment could help us to do the interior work and open ourselves to the kind of relationship with Christ that does lead to real change, through our own choices, our own commitments, and through the grace of God. And I want to be clear that I think the reason Ignatius believes we must change, the reason I think he would hate this "that's just the way I am" mentality, is not that he believes that humans are so awful. We can be, and we're very capable of violence and sin and evil. Ignatius had to have seen that in war and in many places in his journeys. But Ignatius does believe in the goodness of human beings and our deep-rooted pull towards God. We see that in the principle and foundation, in the very beginning of the exercises. So the reason we ought to change is because of that deep-rooted desire, because it can be nurtured and strengthened and used to reshape our lives, to resist the sin and selfishness. We aren't changing primarily because we are so bad. We are changing first and foremost because Jesus, who we want to follow, is so good. And when you are in love with someone, when you are truly committed to being with someone, you want to be as good to them as they are to you. You want to give them everything they give you and more. Ignatius was a man of desire, he was a man of will, he was a man of commitment, but at his core, he was a man of great love. He was a man who entered wholeheartedly into Lent, not out of self-hatred, but out of excitement for the joy of Easter morning. The model he left us, the spirituality he left us, is meant to make us people of great love and great joy too. It is meant to guide us through Lent so that we can truly be an Easter people, sharing with others the joy of the risen Christ that we've come to know. I hope we can take up that challenge. I have faith that we can with the grace of God. So thank you.
We do have some room for questions, and
perhaps there might be some questions out there that anyone would like to ask. Nick?
Sure.
Did Ignatius become head of the order because he chose his companions or because they chose him?
I would say certainly because they chose him. He actually, so the question was, did Ignatius become the head of the Jesuits, the head of the Society of Jesus, because he chose his companions or because his companions chose him? So actually Ignatius had several groups of companions over the years, and there were guys who sort of fell away, who decided that this wasn't the life that they wanted to live, or who just didn't have the resolve to continue on with Ignatius. But ultimately, a group of 10 of them wound up in Rome asking permission to go to Jerusalem, and were denied, and would become kind of the core of the early society. And they unanimously chose him to be the first Father General, and he resisted several times until his own spiritual director told him, "You have to do this. Clearly the Spirit is working here." So it's another example of where even at that point in his life, he had these different desires and had to choose. And he committed to this early community, to this beginning of what would become the Jesuits. And that commitment meant that he had to take seriously the discernment of his brothers, who said, "No, you have to lead us. You were the one who gave us this spirituality. You were the one through whom God has worked to bring this all about. It has to be you who leads it." So that's my thought on it.
How's the original vision of Saint Ignatius applied to the way the Jesuits operate today?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So the question was, how does the original vision of Ignatius for the Society of Jesus apply to the way we as Jesuits live today? I think there are many ways to answer that question that could go for a whole other talk, I think. But if I had to emphasize one thing, I would say discernment. Ignatius is adamant about discernment as an ongoing thing, as an ongoing process, that we continue to look for the way the Spirit moves. So you see in the early society, for instance, that Ignatius's first vision of the society was for it to be a very mobile group of people. He didn't think it would be as big as it wound up being, and he imagined these kinds of task forces, if you will, or mission bands, as they were once called, of small groups of people who would go and do different things in different places. They would preach here, they would hear confessions, they would maybe give lectures. But early on, because of the relationships that the early Jesuits built, they started receiving requests, starting in Sicily, for schools. And that was never in Ignatius's initial vision. But because of his commitment to the greater glory of God, he started to discern, is God calling us to change this vision here, to move on from something that had a point initially, but that maybe needs to give way to something else because that's where the Spirit is moving. And the discernment led to the founding of the first school, and I mean, history started from there. I mean, here we are standing today in a city with 3 Jesuit schools. We have Good Shepherd, we have Jesuit High, we have Loyola here, and I'm at another Jesuit school in New York where there are dozens of schools, well, a dozen schools probably. So that was something that Ignatius didn't foresee, but by continuing to apply that principle of discernment, by continuing to identify that deep desire, but realize that it would continue to manifest in new desires, and that's the work of the Spirit, we continue that project today. We continue to listen to the needs of the world, to listen to the needs of the people with whom we work and from whom we learn, and we continue to try to discern how God might be calling us to new things within that.
Good question. Yes?
Yes.
So is discernment the glue that keeps the Jesuits together?
I mean, I think that's a fair way of describing it. I mean, I think when a Jesuit or a group of Jesuits stops discerning, then that's a very dangerous thing for them. And that's why when Ignatius was training the first Jesuits, when he started to send letters to novices or to scholastics, he would continue to emphasize the examen prayer that many of us I know have learned through our time at Loyola. It's one of the first things that that Jesuits like to teach people, because it can be, if done right, and if we continue to be intentional about it, it can be a way of discerning in an everyday setting, of not just making discernment about the big decisions that are on the horizon, but about making discernment a listening to where the Spirit is in each day and each experience with people, with ourselves, with all of the different things that we encounter in our day. And so I think, in a way, because of how it should enter into our daily life of prayer and the examine and living in community and working in whatever mission we've been given, discernment is very much a kind of glue. And if a Jesuit stops discerning, then I think a lot of those things will start to suffer. Any other questions?
One in the back.
Oh.
Yes, your talk was very good, very much appreciated. Any books that we might pick up on for
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh. So the question was, are there any books that I might recommend for learning more about Ignatius or Ignatian spirituality? I mean, his autobiography itself is fairly readable. I mean, it was written in the 16th century, and maybe that says more about what I like to read than anything else. I mean, I do study the medieval period, but I do think, I think there's a reason it's captured the imagination of people for generations, and there are a couple of different editions of it. I think Father Ted in his class, do you still use the Joseph Talenda translation, the Pilgrims Journey?
We do.
So there's one called the Pilgrims Journey that I think is probably pretty cheap on Amazon. That has really good notes. It has a really good sort of introduction. So that's one. But then there are many others that I think get at different aspects of Ignatius, either as a person or of his spirituality. So there's one by a guy named David Lonsdale called Eyes to See, Ears to Hear, that is more of a breaking down of different parts of Ignatius's life, kind of like I did, but in more depth, and over a 200-page book. And it looks at different images of Ignatius too. Another one that I might recommend that uses Ignatius as a jumping-off point is actually was referenced kind of earlier tonight. Father Jerry Fagan. So there was the book that was made out of his talks here, but then I think some of his notes from that were turned into another book called Discovering Your Dream, I believe it's called. Is that, am I getting it right? And it's a wonderful short book, and Father Fagan was a spiritual master and really understood Ignatius well, and I think had an especial gift for trying to get at key parts of Ignatius and communicating that to people who were new to Ignatius. So that book could be very helpful as a place to start if this was your first introduction to Ignatius tonight. So those are the ones that come to mind. But there are many good ones out there, and I think if you started to look at those, you might find yourself with other ones as well. Any other questions?
Well, I think, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.